Have you ever noticed sometimes when playing through Halo, some things just seem a little bit odd or maybe don't fully make sense until you think about it for a while, or maybe some plot points just kind of jump from one place to another really quickly? Typically speaking, Halo games are kind of one of those big games that have very ambitious people working behind them, coming up with a ton of ideas, but like any game, when it gets time to start to push into that final leg of finishing the game up and getting it ready for release, a lot of the time, some decisions have to be made as to what changes or things could be cut to best get the game done in time so that players have a polished product that they can experience. And over the years, there's been a ton of really ambitious ideas that kind of got scrapped in favor of streamlining the production of the Halo games. It's always really fun to take a look back at some things that could have been different, but just barely didn't make the cut. But first, have you ever wondered, what if Master Chief was finally bored of old school RuneScape all day and he wanted to play something different? Well, we'd like to think that he would have luckily remembered that his favorite Halo YouTube channel had a sponsor that would provide a game just like that. And as it turns out, today's video is sponsored by Core, which is a platform that lets you create and play Unreal-based PC games for free. Core offers a huge variety of games for you to choose. One of the most popular games that we've been playing is Strike Team, which is a fast-paced FPS that has two teams compete for control of the battlefield. It's really smooth to play and actually feels like a full shooter, but it's one of the many options that you have. We've even given mini golf a play with some friends, which is always fun, and new games are added every day, and the platform is rapidly growing. Also, Core wanted us to mention a tournament that they're doing over on their platform, a all-new player competition called Guns and Glory, where if you play in 3 of Core's top shooters and you get to the top of the leaderboards, you actually get a slice of a $6,000 prize pool, which is a new tournament that runs from Thursday, March 18th to Thursday, March 25th. You can enter and play for free through the link in the description. And also make sure to use our link to download Core down below. For instance, one of my personal favorite headcanon moments in Halo Combat Evolved is the fact that when Master Chief escapes from the Pillar of Autumn, when he crash lands on the Halo ring, all of those Marines, they just didn't make it. And in my head, I always assumed since Master Chief didn't buckle up, he just kind of ping-ponged around inside of that drop pod, and yikes. And while this can totally be canon because I decided that it is, I actually tweeted out about this as a joke a few weeks ago, and Halo Combat Evolved game designer Jamie Griesemer from Bungie back in the day actually replied to my tweet talking a little bit behind the scenes as to what went on there. He actually explained that as it turned out, all of those Marines ended up dying because the exit animations were going to take too long to finish. And when Duquesne23 suggested just having them spawn outside of the pod, Jamie replied that they tried that, but they would slip and fall off the waterfall bridge half the time anyways, and it didn't fit the mood they were trying to set. So while it is interesting to think that those Marines almost did make it, it also is kind of hilarious to think what it was like during the testing phases when all of those Marines were just sprinting off the bridge accidentally. In another video we did a while back talking about the Warthog run on the Pillar of Autumn and that odd bridge that was there, upon doing a little bit of further research, it actually does look like at one point there was a concept art for the Pillar of Autumn hanging over a cliff. It actually is really interesting, and while we don't have 100% confirmation that this turned out to be the bridge that we saw, it would make a little more sense as to the long-term plan that the Warthog run may have had, where there would have been an opening section always planned in for that part of the game, though we honestly have no idea. Just the fact that it is really interesting that at one point there was plans for the Pillar of Autumn to be hanging over a cliff more than just straight up the way that it is in Combat Evolved. We also can look back at some of the earliest demos and reveal footage for what would become Halo Combat Evolved, and there's definitely a lot of environmental creatures and other types of living species that players would likely encounter, and likely with just the sheer scope of how many ideas we've seen in the conceptual phase of Halo Combat Evolved, these ended up getting cut just because it sounds like somewhat of a nightmare to try to program a vast majority of neutral environmental creatures versus the actual enemy AI, which probably took a priority. I mean, even the engineers got cut in that last phase of development because Bungie employees didn't really feel like they knew the right way to make these creatures work efficiently in gameplay. Now, a lot of the times people look at Halo 2 and one massive thing that was cut was the demo level that was shown off at E3. Now, the main reason this ended up getting cut was the fact that Bungie couldn't get the build of the game to consistently run on the Xbox hardware, and in result, this level never actually made it into the final build of the game. But it doesn't look like the plans were fully cut off there as well for other features of Halo 2. If you look at the initial teaser trailer for Halo 2, you see Master Chief jumping into space, much like we do at the end of Cairo Station, but in Cairo Station, that time, he actually has a bomb with him. Essentially, there would have been an entire level in between Cairo Station and the beginning of Outskirts where Master Chief would have boarded the Covenant cruiser and detonated a bomb from inside, but in favor of saving time, that whole level ended up getting cut and kind of turned into this cutscene where we see Master Chief just flying through space, somehow jumping all the way back to the other ship with a light little bounce here. And it's one example of how Halo 2 kind of had to jump forward with moving the plot along using cutscenes to at least make sure everything made sense if they were going to have to cut out some massive levels. This is a similar situation with the Gravemind introduction, as originally there were plans for the Gravemind to kind of introduce himself in the form of the regular Flood, just talking from all directions. There was supposed to be another level kind of in between Quarantine Zone and Gravemind. It also kind of pays an excuse as to why that cutscene and dialogue is one of the longest dialogue-focused, exposition-filled cutscenes we see in all of Halo. When we get to Halo 3, the level Floodgate is incredibly interesting to us. Besides the fact that it's one of Luke and I's favorite levels in all of Halo, there's something really interesting going on if you listen carefully to Miranda Keyes' line at the very beginning.
The Flood. It's spreading all over the city.
How do we contain it?
Find the crashed Flood ship. Overload its engine core. We either destroy this city or risk losing the entire planet.
Do it.
Chief, make your way to the crash site.
Yeah, so she orders you to do that, but we never actually do that anytime in this level. However, later on in the level Cortana, which shares a very similar aesthetic to the flood-infested Covenant ship that we see at the end of this level, we do kind of exactly that though. And seemingly in the process of saving time with production, they ended up choosing to split up this level that would have had Master Chief going into a flood-infested Covenant ship at the end of Floodgate into two separate levels, where Master Chief travels through a small hallway at the end of Floodgate and locates a message from Cortana instead of Cortana herself, and then later on he is on High Charity in a very similar looking level where he goes and retrieves Cortana later on in the story. Matter of fact, during one point in production, there was a level that would have actually looked more like High Charity did in Halo 2, where Master Chief would have gone through there instead, but since they already were going to be cutting out the other level that was already mostly done, they kind of just ported it over and did the best they could at making it look like High Charity by doing major things like adjusting the skybox. Also, another really interesting concept that ended up getting cut earlier on in Halo 3 was definitely the Forerunner City level that's been talked amongst the Halo fanbase for quite some time. There were concept arts for it, and likely there were some early builds constructing what it would have looked like had this version been made for the Ark where Master Chief would travel to, likely before meeting up with the Prophet of Truth. However, it seems like sometime during production, Bungie likely made the decision that they didn't want to over-explain the Forerunner technology or reveal too much as to what the Forerunners were like, to kind of keep some level of mysticism to those beings and stories that kind of hide in the underlying architecture of the game. And while we've actually done an entire video on another cut level from Halo 3, Guardian, which is so fascinating, both concept art for the Guardian and the Forerunner City were later used in an episode of Halo Legends, so it is kind of something that did end up living on beyond Halo 3. In Halo 3 ODST, one thing that's really interesting is when they were designing the game, they really wanted New Mombasa to have this atmosphere of it being dark and a rainy place. But as it would turn out, making a real-time rain system work in New Mombasa on the Halo 3 engine, given the time that they had for release, wasn't really something that would be possible. However, chances are when you think back to Halo 3 ODST, you remember the rain, right? This is actually one of the coolest things about Halo 3 ODST, but as it turns out, they used different sound effects and a musical soundtrack that kind of built the illusion of rain, along with a few visual effects to make it feel like you're in this wet, abandoned city, whether it's things like a little splish splash when you're walking down an alleyway, or just the general aesthetic that went throughout New Mombasa. It's one of the coolest little details and the coolest way that using other techniques to portray an idea have been utilized in Halo. Also, the Gutas in Halo Reach that show up on Nightfall, for example, were originally supposed to not only make their return after being cut from Combat Evolved, but actually were going to play a little bit more prominent of a role as an enemy, though it proved to be a little bit more challenging than was expected and ended up being condensed to just what we saw in that level of Nightfall. Also, while there's not as much information out there for things from Halo 4 and Halo 5, we can look to the fact that split screen was likely cut from Halo 5 Guardians because of the fact that Halo 5 was heavily targeting that 60 frames per second, and doing split screen was likely too challenging, and they likely chose to cut it out rather than dealing with the hurdles of refining the gameplay for split screen. But what feature would you have wished originally appeared in Halo back in the day? Let us know in the comments down below. Also, make sure you guys check out our Discord server if you guys aren't a part of our community already. There's a link in the description down below. Also, huge shout out to Core for sponsoring this video. There's a link also to their stuff down below. All right, we'll see you guys all next time with a new video.